The text came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning while I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a Kroger in Louisville, Kentucky, eating a granola bar because I hadn't had time for breakfast, and my next meeting was in 40 minutes, and the granola bar was the most realistic option available. The text was from my sister. It was a photograph. The photograph showed a wire transfer confirmation on a banking app screen. The kind of screen that showed up green when a deposit cleared. The kind that had a number on it with enough digits that your eyes did a second pass to make sure you were reading it correctly. Below the photograph, my sister had typed 4 words. "Thanks for the cash." I stared at my phone for a long time. The granola bar was still in my hand. The Kroger parking lot was doing its ordinary Tuesday morning thing around me, carts moving, engines starting, a woman with 2 children loading bags into an SUV near the entrance. Everything normal, everything completely indifferent to what I was looking at on my screen. My grandmother's house had just been sold. I knew this because my sister had sent me the wire transfer confirmation like a victory lap, like a trophy photo, like the specific kind of message you sent someone when you wanted them to know they had lost, and you wanted to make sure they understood the magnitude of the loss before they found out through official channels. The house was a Victorian on a tree-lined street in the Highlands neighborhood of Louisville. My grandmother, Ruth Elaine Caldwell, had bought it in 1971 with my grandfather Bernard for $43,000, which was everything they had at the time, and which required them to live on precise margins for the better part of a decade. The house had appreciated over 50 years in the way that well-maintained homes in well-situated Louisville neighborhoods appreciated, steadily, substantially, without drama. Its current assessed value was just under $2 million. My sister had just sold it, or believed she had just sold it, or had received a wire transfer she believed represented the sale of it, and she had texted me the confirmation with a smiling emoji because she believed I had been cut out of my grandmother's will and that the house was entirely hers to sell, and that this moment was the conclusion of a competition she had been running in her head for years. She was wrong about several things. Not about the house's value. The house was worth what it was worth, and the real estate market in the Highlands had been what it had been, and neither of those things was in dispute. She was wrong about the will. She was wrong about what the trust actually said. She was wrong about whether I had signed anything. And she was spectacularly, consequentially wrong about whether the bank was going to process that wire transfer the way she thought it was going to process it. I finished the granola bar, not because I was hungry anymore, because finishing it gave me something to do with my hands while I thought about what I was going to do next. The granola bar tasted like nothing. I wrapped the empty wrapper carefully and put it in the cup holder, and I sat there in the Kroger parking lot in Louisville with the granola bar wrapper in the cup holder and my sister's smiling emoji on my phone, and I started to understand the shape of what was about to happen. Here is the thing about trust documents that my sister had never taken the time to understand, because she had spent her energy on a different kind of preparation. She had spent her energy on making sure my grandmother's declining health produced the outcome she wanted. She had spent her energy on positioning herself as the devoted daughter, the present one, the one who deserved everything. She had spent her energy on managing the narrative. She had not spent any energy understanding what I had signed in a lawyer's office in Lexington 14 months earlier on a Thursday afternoon, when my grandmother had asked me to drive her to her attorney's office because she had something she needed to handle, and she wanted me there, and she trusted me with the specifics. That Thursday afternoon was the whole story. My sister didn't know about that Thursday afternoon. She was about to find out about it from a bank. Not from me. I was not going to call her. I was not going to reply to the text with the smiling emoji. I was not going to explain anything or argue anything, or give her the specific satisfaction of watching me react to something she had done to hurt me. I was going to let the bank make the call. I was going to sit in my car in the Kroger parking lot and eat my granola bar, except I had already eaten the granola bar, so I was going to sit in my car and think about my grandmother, about the house, about the specific smell of it, that combination of old wood and lavender, and whatever she baked on the weekends that never quite left the kitchen. About the way she had looked at me on that Thursday afternoon in the lawyer's office, after the signing, after everything was done, when she had put her hand over mine on the conference room table and said, "You are the one who understands why I did it this way." I had understood. I had not told anyone. My sister was about to find out why that mattered. But before we get to that bank call, before we get to what my sister's face looked like, when the number she thought had cleared started moving in a direction she had not planned for, I need to take you back. All the way back to a house in Louisville and a grandmother who was the only person in my family who ever looked at me and saw what was actually there. If you've ever been the quiet one, the overlooked one, the one the family discounted because you weren't loud enough or strategic enough or present at the right dinners with the right agenda, stay with me. Because this story is for you and it goes exactly where you need it to go. Hit that like button right now if you're already with me. Subscribe to this channel if you're new here. I promise you won't regret it. Ring that notification bell because the next story is always coming and you want to be here when it does. Now let's go back to Louisville, to a Victorian house on a tree-lined street, and to two sisters who grew up in the same house and became completely different people. My name is Diana Caldwell, and I am 34 years old. I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, which is the kind of city that people who have never been there underestimate, and people who have grown up there understand in a specific way that is hard to explain to anyone who didn't. It's not a small town, and it's not a big city, and it has the particular combination of Southern warmth and Midwestern practicality that produces people who are genuinely hospitable and also genuinely no-nonsense, and who will tell you something true with a smile that means both things simultaneously. My grandmother's house was the center of everything. Not just geographically, though it was close to central for most of the family's Louisville geography. It was the center in the way that certain homes became centers by being the place where things happened. Holidays, obviously, but also the ordinary things. Sunday afternoons that stretched into evenings. The specific kind of nothing in particular visiting that families did when they actually liked being around each other, or at least when the version of the family that liked being around each other gathered at that particular house. My grandmother, Ruth, was the reason for that. She had the quality that the best people had, which was the quality of making you feel like you were the most interesting thing in the room without performing interest. She was actually interested. She remembered what you had told her 3 months ago about a problem at work and asked what had happened with it. She noticed when something was different about you before you had figured out how to say it. She made the kind of eye contact that was not intense, but was complete, the eye contact of someone who was entirely there. She had grown up in Lexington, one of 5 children of a tobacco farmer named James Hensley, and a woman named Clara who had worked as a seamstress and raised 5 children, and run a household on a budget that required genuine creativity. Ruth had come to Louisville at 19 for a secretarial program, and had met my grandfather Bernard at a church dance in 1964, and had married him a year later, and had spent the next 57 years building the specific thing she built, which was a home that functioned as a foundation for everyone who entered it. She and Bernard had 2 children. My mother, Carol, born in 1967. My Aunt Sandra, born in 1970. My mother, Carol, was the first daughter and the more complicated one, which is how first daughters in certain families often worked. She had inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's stubbornness, and the combination had produced a woman who was capable of extraordinary things and was also extremely difficult to be around when she had decided something, which she usually had. She had married my father, Thomas Caldwell, in 1988, and they had moved to Louisville's East End and had me in 1991, and had my sister Melissa in 1994, and had divorced in 2002 with the specific efficiency of 2 people who had been building to it for years and who were finally relieved when it was done. My sister Melissa. I need to tell you about Melissa before I tell you anything else about what happened, because Melissa is the engine of this story, and you can't understand the engine without understanding what built it. Melissa was 3 years younger than me and had been, from birth onward, the louder version of everything I was. I was quiet. She was loud. I read books. She worked rooms. I preferred one good conversation over a party. She preferred the party and the party and the party after the party. I was the child who sat beside my grandmother in the kitchen on Sunday afternoons learning how to make things from scratch. Melissa was the child who came in for the finished product, ate it enthusiastically, complimented it genuinely, and then went back to whatever was happening in the more social part of the house. This is not a criticism. Melissa was genuinely warm, genuinely funny. She had the kind of energy that made events feel like events rather than obligations, and the kind of magnetism that drew people toward her at parties and kept them there. She was not a bad person in the simple sense of the word. She was a person who had developed, over the course of her life, a specific and deeply embedded belief about how the world worked, which was that the person who was most present and most visible and most strategically positioned in any given situation was the person who received the reward. This belief was not entirely wrong. The world frequently rewarded the loudest and most visible person. The world frequently overlooked the quieter, more consistent, less strategically visible person. Melissa's model of how things worked was not irrational. It was just incomplete. The incompleteness was going to matter. I had left Louisville at 22 for a business management program at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, which was not dramatic geographically, but was enough of a distance that I was not present for the daily family life the way I had been. I had stayed in Lexington after graduating because I found work there, at a small financial planning firm that turned out to be, in my case, exactly the right environment. I was good at the detail work. I was good at the documentation. I was good at reading the dense materials that financial and legal planning required and understanding not just what they said on the surface, but what they meant at the level of structure and implication. My boss at the firm, a man named Gerald Whitmore who was 63 and had been doing estate and trust planning in central Kentucky for 30 years, had said to me at my 6-month review, "Diana, most people in this work either understand the human side or the technical side. The ones who are actually valuable understand both. You understand both." I had stayed for 9 years. Melissa had stayed in Louisville. She had married a man named Kevin Horton in 2018, a mortgage broker with a confident manner and a good salary and the specific social fluency that made other people's parents like him at first meeting. She had worked in marketing for a few years and then stopped working to manage what she described as the household and what increasingly became the management of my grandmother's affairs as Ruth got older and needed more help. The help was real. I want to be honest about that. As my grandmother aged through her late 70s and into her early 80s, she genuinely needed more assistance, and Melissa was genuinely present in ways that I, living 2 hours away and working full-time, was not. Melissa drove her to appointments. Melissa managed the household repairs. Melissa organized the social calendar that kept my grandmother connected to her church friends and her neighborhood relationships that were the texture of her daily life. But there is always a but in stories like this, and the but is not that Melissa's help was insincere. I believe it was partially sincere. The but is that the help was also strategic in a way that Melissa was probably not fully conscious of, the way that people were strategic about things they wanted without always admitting to themselves that the wanting was shaping the behavior. Melissa had decided, somewhere around the time our grandmother turned 80, that the house was hers. Not legally, not through any document or decision. In the way that people decided things in their minds before the formal process confirmed them and then had difficulty distinguishing between what they had decided and what was actually true. She had told her husband Kevin the house was hers. She had told her friends the house was hers. She had told our mother Carol, who had told me with a slightly apologetic quality that suggested she was passing along information she was not entirely comfortable with, that Melissa was counting on the house and had made plans around it. I had said, "What plans?" My mother had said, "I don't think she wants to sell it, she wants to keep it." I had said, "It's Grandma's house. Grandma decides what happens to it." My mother had said, I know Diana. That conversation had happened 2 years before my grandmother called me on a Sunday evening in February and said she needed me to drive to Lexington the following Thursday because she had something important to handle, and she wanted me there. She didn't tell me what it was over the phone. She said, "I'll explain when you get here." I had learned over 34 years that when my grandmother said she would explain when you got there, you did not push for more information over the phone. You showed up. I showed up. I drove to Lexington on a Thursday morning in February on roads that still had the remnants of last week's snow along the edges, and I picked my grandmother up from the house, and I drove her to the office of a man named Howard Barnett, a state attorney, on a street in downtown Lexington that had the specific architecture of professional services buildings in medium-sized Kentucky cities. Solid, dignified, slightly dated in a way that communicated reliability rather than stagnation. Howard Barnett was 68 years old and had the quality of someone who had spent decades sitting across from families during important and often difficult moments, and who had developed the kind of steadiness that came from that specific experience. He stood when we came in, shook my grandmother's hand with the warmth of someone who had known her for a while, shook mine with the warmth of someone meeting an important person for the first time. He said, "Ruth, thank you for bringing Diana." My grandmother said, "She's the right one to have here." He looked at me. He said, "Your grandmother has been working on some estate planning for several months. She's made decisions she wanted to discuss with you and have your involvement in." I looked at my grandmother. She was 81 years old, and she had the specific quality that the best old people had, which was that she was entirely herself in a way that required no management or performance. She was wearing the gray wool coat she had worn to every winter occasion for the past decade, and her hair was white, and her eyes were the specific sharp blue they had always been, and she looked at me the way she always looked at me, which was directly and completely. She said, "I've set up a trust. I want to explain it to you before we sign anything, because I want you to understand what I decided and why." I said, "Okay, Grandma." Howard opened a folder. And what followed was the 2 hours that changed everything. The trust that my grandmother had established was called the Ruth E. Caldwell Living Trust, and Howard Barnett had been drafting it, revising it, and discussing it with my grandmother over approximately 9 months before I sat in his office on that February Thursday. My grandmother did not use the word revenge. She would not have used that word. She was not a person who thought in those terms, and the decisions she had made were not shaped by that impulse. But what she had built, quietly, over 9 months of careful legal work, was a structure that was precise in the way that structures built by people who had paid close attention for a long time were precise. It accounted for things. She explained the trust to me in Howard's office in the specific direct way she explained everything, which was without softening what needed to be said clearly. She said the house was going into the trust. She said the trust had 2 primary beneficiaries, me and my cousin Angela, who was my Aunt Sandra's daughter and who had grown up in Elizabethtown and was now a teacher in Bowling Green, and who had the particular quality of steady decency that made her the most liked person at any family gathering without her working at it. She said my sister, Melissa, was not a primary beneficiary of the trust. She said this without drama, without anger, with the specific settled quality of someone who has made a difficult decision over a long period and has arrived at the place of having made it and is now past the difficulty and into the clarity. I said, "Grandma." She said, "Let me finish." I let her finish. She said that Melissa would receive a specific cash bequest from the estate, a real amount, a generous amount by most people's standards, and that the cash bequest was separate from the trust and would be handled through the will. She said Melissa was not being cut off. She was being given something clear. She said the house, through the trust, was being left to me and Angela jointly, with a specific structure around decision-making that Howard had helped her design. She said she had thought about this for a long time, and she had made the decision she had made for reasons she was going to explain to me, and she wanted me to hear them before I responded. I said, "Okay." She said, "I love Melissa. I want you to know that first. She has been here. She has helped me. I am grateful for it. I said, I know, Grandma. She said, but Melissa has been helping me with a plan in her head that is not the same as the plan I actually have. She has been very kind to me over these years, and part of the kindness has been genuine and part of it has been connected to what she expects to receive. And I have watched both of those things be true at the same time for long enough to understand the difference. I said nothing. She said, she has told people the house is hers. She has made financial plans around it. She told Kevin she was going to sell it and use the money for certain things they are planning. She did not tell me any of this. She told other people. And it got back to me the way things get back to old women in Louisville, because old women in Louisville have been paying attention longer than most people realize. She paused. She said, if I leave the house to Melissa in the way she expects, the house will be sold within 6 months, and the money will go toward a life plan that has nothing to do with what the house means. And I understand that's how inheritances work. I understand that people sell things they inherit and use the money for their lives, and that is not wrong. But the house is the house, and I would like the house to be with someone who understands what the house is. She looked at me. She said, you understand what the house is? I said, yes. She said, Angela understands too. I talked to her. She said, Melissa's cash bequest is real and it's enough. She'll be upset. I understand that. I have thought about it a great deal. But I have earned the right to decide what happens to the thing Bernard and I built, and I am deciding. Howard had been quiet through most of this. He said, Diana, I want to make sure you understand the trust structure and your role in it before we discuss the signing. He walked me through the documents. The trust was precise. The house was the primary asset. Me and Angela as joint beneficiaries with a clear decision-making structure if we disagreed on anything related to the property. A specific timeline for any sale, should we choose to sell, that required agreement and a formal process. A trustee appointment, Howard himself, for the initial period with clear succession planning. And a provision that was the specific provision that would matter 6 months after my grandmother's passing. The provision said that any attempted transfer, sale, or encumbrance of the trust property without proper authorization from both beneficiaries and the trustee was void and without legal effect, and that any proceeds from such an unauthorized transaction would be subject to immediate legal recovery, with associated costs borne by the party who initiated the unauthorized transaction. Howard had said, while explaining this provision, this is standard protective language in trust documents. It's here because sometimes family members act before they understand the legal structure. He had paused briefly. Your grandmother asked me to make it particularly thorough. My grandmother had been looking out the window when he said this. She had said very quietly, yes, I did ask that. I had understood what that meant. I signed the documents. The trust was executed. Howard filed the necessary paperwork. The house was formally titled in the trust's name. We had driven back to Louisville that Thursday evening, and my grandmother had been quiet most of the way. The comfortable quiet of someone who had done something they had been building toward and was sitting in the completion of it. I had stopped at a diner on the way, and we had eaten soup and grilled cheese sandwiches at a booth by the window, and she had told me about the first winter in the house, 1971, when the furnace had failed in January, and she and Bernard had used every blanket they owned and had laughed about it the way young people laugh about hardship when they are in it together, and it hasn't broken anything yet. I had said, I love that house. She had said, I know you do. I had said, I'll take care of it. She had said, I know you will. We had driven the rest of the way to Louisville in the comfortable quiet. My grandmother Ruth died the following March, 14 months after that Thursday in Howard's office. She passed at home, in her bedroom in the Victorian house, on a Tuesday morning, with Melissa and my mother Carol present, and with me on the phone having driven up the previous weekend, and then driven back to Lexington on Monday morning for a meeting I had not been able to cancel. I had spoken to her Sunday evening before I left. She had been tired but clear. She had said, drive safe going home. I had said, I will, Grandma. She had said, good. That was the last thing she said to me. The grief arrived with the specific weight of grief when it is the loss of the right person, the person who saw you, who made you feel like you were supposed to be there, who understood you before you understood yourself. I had known she was going. We had known for months. Knowing did not make the specific Tuesday morning phone call any different in terms of what it cost. I drove to Louisville for the funeral. I sat with my mother and my Aunt Sandra and Angela and the extended family and the church friends and the neighbors who had known my grandmother for decades. I sat at the house that smelled like old wood and lavender and the remnants of 100 Sundays, and I accepted condolences from people who had loved her, and I was present for everything that being present was required for. Melissa was there. Kevin was there. Melissa had the expression of someone who was genuinely grieving and also actively planning, which I recognized because I had known her for 30 years and could read both things at once. She cried at the service. She organized the reception with the genuine efficiency of someone who was good at those things. She stood at the door of the house and received people with a warmth that was real and was also, I understood watching it, the warmth of someone who was standing in a house they already considered theirs. I said nothing about the trust. Not at the funeral, not at the reception, not in the weeks after when Melissa started making comments about needing to figure out what to do with the house, and making them in the specific way that assumed figuring it out meant having the authority to decide. Howard Barnett had contacted me after the funeral. He had expressed condolences. He had said that when I was ready to discuss the trust administration, he was available. I had said thank you and I would be in touch. I was ready 2 weeks after the funeral. Howard and I had a call. He walked me through the process. He had already been in contact with Angela in Bowling Green. Angela had said, quietly and without drama, "I loved Aunt Ruth and I trust you, Diana. Whatever you decide about the house, I will support." That was Angela. That was exactly Angela. Howard said there were certain steps the estate needed to go through for the will's provisions, Melissa's cash bequest, and other matters, before the trust's assets could be fully transitioned. He estimated 4 to 6 weeks. He said I should not take any action regarding the house during that period, but that the trust documentation would be filed, and that anyone attempting to transact the property during that period would encounter it. I had said, "What if Melissa tries to sell it?" Howard had paused for a moment. He had said, "That would be an interesting situation." I had said, "Should I warn her?" Howard had been quiet for a longer moment. He had said, "Diana, you are under no legal obligation to notify anyone of the trust's existence before they encounter it. The trust is a public document. It has been filed. It is accessible to anyone who performs the appropriate title search. Standard real estate transactions require title searches. Any competent real estate transaction professional would find it." He had said this carefully, in the specific way of a lawyer who was not telling you what to do, but was giving you the information you needed to make the decision yourself. I had said, "I understand." I had not warned anyone. Melissa moved faster than I expected. That was the thing I had not fully planned for. I had assumed she would move quickly, but I had estimated quickly to mean a few weeks after the funeral, after the formal probate process began, after she had at least had a conversation with Howard Barnett about the estate's structure. I had estimated she would do at least some due diligence before initiating a transaction involving a $2 million property. I was wrong. She initiated the sale 3 weeks after the funeral. I found out not from Melissa. I had not heard from Melissa in 2 weeks, which itself told me something was happening because we had spoken regularly in the weeks immediately after the death, and the sudden silence was not the silence of someone who was processing grief privately. It was the silence of someone who was busy. I found out from a real estate agent named Brenda Walsh, who called me on a Monday afternoon because, as she explained in a voice that had the specific quality of someone who was delivering information they had not expected to be delivering in this context. My name had come up in a title search she had run on the property at my grandmother's address in the Highlands. She said, "Ms. Caldwell, I am the listing agent for the property at," and she gave the address. I said, "Yes." She said, I need to ask you some questions about a trust document that's attached to this title. I said, of course. She said, the property appears to be titled in a trust, the Ruth E. Caldwell Living Trust. Are you familiar with it? I said, yes. She said, your name appears in the trust documentation as a co-beneficiary. I said, yes. There was a pause on her end, a pause that communicated that she was recalibrating the conversation she had thought she was going to have. She said, Ms. Caldwell, I am representing a seller who has represented to me that this property is being sold as part of a standard estate transaction. The title search has revealed the trust structure. I want to understand the current status of the trust before we proceed. I said, the trust is active. It was established by Ruth Caldwell 14 months before her death and properly filed. The property is a trust asset. It cannot be sold without authorization from both beneficiaries and the trustee. Brenda Walsh was quiet for a moment that was longer than a comfortable pause. She said, I see. She said, I was not made aware of this trust when I took this listing. I said, I understand. She said, I am going to need to have a conversation with my client before we can proceed. I said, I understand. She said, I apologize for any confusion. I said, you don't need to apologize. You ran the title search. That's exactly what title searches are for. She said, yes, well, another pause. Thank you for your time. I said, of course. She hung up. I sat at my desk in my apartment in Lexington, and I thought about Melissa. I thought about what Brenda Walsh was about to say to her. I thought about the expression on Melissa's face when she heard the words trust document and co-beneficiary and cannot be sold without authorization from both beneficiaries. My phone rang 40 minutes later. Melissa. I let it go to voicemail. She called back 2 minutes after that. I let that one go to voicemail too. She sent a text that said, Diana, call me now. I finished the report I was working on. I emailed it to my supervisor. I made a cup of coffee. I sat down with the coffee and I looked at my phone. Then I called her back. She answered before the first ring had completed. She said, what did you do? Not a question. The specific flat delivery of someone who was beyond the question stage and into the accusation stage. I said, hi, Melissa. She said, what did you do? There is a trust on Grandma's house. The realtor called me. She said she can't process the sale. She said your name is on the document. What did you do? I said, I signed the trust documents with Grandma 14 months ago. She said, she stopped. I heard her breathing. You are telling me that 14 months ago Grandma had a trust drawn up and put your name on it. I said, and Angela's. Silence. She said, Angela. I said, yes. She said, not mine. I said, no. The silence this time was longer, long enough that I thought for a moment she had put the phone down. Then she said, in a voice that was different from the accusation voice, quieter, something sharper underneath it. She knew, and she didn't tell me. I said, Grandma made the decisions she thought were right. She said, Diana, I have put a sale together. The buyer is real. The contract is signed. I told Kevin. She stopped. I said, Melissa. She said, how much of the house did she leave you? I said, half, me and Angela jointly. She said, and the other half? I said, Angela. She said, she left me nothing. I said, she left you a cash bequest through the will. Howard Barnett will be in contact about the estate administration. You'll receive it when the probate process is complete. She said, a cash bequest. I said, yes. She said, Diana, how much? I told her the amount. She was quiet. The amount was real. It was the amount my grandmother had decided on and had discussed with Howard Barnett over 9 months of estate planning, and it was a real number that represented real money. It was not the same as half a $2 million house, but it was not nothing. Melissa said, she knew what I was planning. She knew I was going to sell it. I said, yes. She said, "And she did this anyway." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you knew? You knew for 14 months." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you said nothing?" I said, "No." She said, "Diana, I have already sent wire instructions to the buyer's bank. This is..." Her voice broke slightly in a way that was the first thing she had said in this conversation that was not strategic. "Kevin thinks the money is coming. We've made plans. We bought..." She stopped. I said, "Melissa, stop." She went quiet. I said, "Call Howard Barnett. His number is in the estate documents. He will walk you through the trust structure and what your options are. But you need to understand that you cannot sell this house without authorization from both Angela and me, and that is not going to change." She said, "What does Angela say?" I said, "You'd have to ask Angela." She said, "Diana, please." The please was the most honest thing she had said in the whole conversation. It was the word under everything else. The word that admitted what the rest of the conversation had been trying to avoid admitting. I said, "Melissa, call Howard." She said, "If I call Howard, what is he going to tell me?" I said, "The truth about the trust." She said, "And what about the buyer? What about Kevin?" I said, "I can't help you with that." She said, "Can you help me with anything?" I thought about that for a moment. I said, "Call Angela. Talk to her yourself, not through me. Angela is a fair person and she'll hear you out and she'll tell you honestly where she stands." Melissa didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "I texted you that wire transfer picture." I said, "I know." She said, "I was being..." I said, "I know what you were being." She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know." I said, "Call Howard." I hung up. I sat with my coffee, which was still warm. Outside my apartment window, Lexington was being Lexington. A February afternoon, gray sky, traffic on the street below, the ordinary machinery of a city's mid-afternoon. I thought about my grandmother's house, about the lavender smell and the old wood and the too strong coffee she made and the Sunday afternoons in the kitchen. I thought about a Thursday in February 14 months ago when she had put her hand over mine on a conference room table and said, "You are the one who understands why I did it this way." I did understand. I had understood then, and I understood now. It wasn't about the money. It was about the thing the money represented. It was about who had been paying attention all along. The wire transfer that Melissa had sent me the photograph of did not clear. This was not a surprise to me. It was, apparently, a significant surprise to the buyer's bank and to the title company involved in the transaction and to Kevin Horton, who had told several people the money was coming and had made at least one financial commitment based on that expectation. Howard Barnett explained the mechanics to me on a call 3 days after my conversation with Melissa. He said that the title company had run a standard title search prior to closing, as title companies did, and the trust document had appeared clearly in the public records, as properly filed trust documents did. He said that the title company had declined to issue title insurance on the transaction because the trust structure made clear that the seller did not have sole authority to convey the property. He said that without title insurance, the buyer's bank would not fund the loan. He said that without the loan funding, the wire transfer that had been sent in anticipation of closing had been flagged and then reversed. He said all of this in the calm, methodical way that Howard said everything, which was the way of a man who had spent 30 years watching families navigate consequences they had not planned for. He said, "Diana, I want to make sure you understand the current state of things." I said, "Please." He said, "The attempted sale has been voided. The buyer's contract will need to be addressed. There may be breach of contract questions depending on how the contract was represented. The title company has a record of the issue. I would recommend that you and Angela have a direct conversation with me about your intentions for the property before anything else happens, so that we are operating from a clear shared understanding." I said, "Angela and I have already talked." He said, "Good. What is your shared position?" I said, we're not selling yet. We want to maintain the property for now and make decisions over time. Neither of us is in a rush. He said, that is entirely within your rights as co-beneficiaries. He said, Melissa contacted me. I said, I expected she would. He said, she is upset. She is also confused about several things, including whether she has any grounds to contest the trust. I said, does she? He said, no, your grandmother was entirely competent when she established the trust. The documentation is thorough. There are no procedural deficiencies. A contest would be expensive and would not succeed. He paused. I told Melissa as much. I said, how did she take that? He said, about as well as you would expect. I said, Howard, what does she actually end up with? He said, her cash bequest from the estate once probate is complete. That process will take a few more weeks. She'll receive it then. I said, in the house? He said, remains in the trust, under your and Angela's authority. I said, is there anything else I need to do? He said, not urgently. I would recommend sending a formal written notification to the buyer's agent documenting your position as co-beneficiary and the status of the trust, just to have it in the record. I can help you draft that if you'd like. I said, yes, let's do that. He said, Diana, can I say something that's slightly outside my strictly legal role? I said, sure. He said, your grandmother spent a lot of time on these documents. We went through many drafts. She was very specific about what she wanted and why. She was not a woman who made decisions carelessly. I said, no, she wasn't. He said, she talked about you. In our meetings, she said, he paused briefly. She said you were the one who came for the right reasons and she had always known the difference. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, thank you, Howard. He said, she was right from what I can observe. Angela called me that evening. She had spoken to Melissa. Not a long conversation, she said. Melissa had been upset and had said some things that were unfair, and Angela had listened without reacting to them because that was how Angela handled things. Angela said, she's really hurting, Diana. I don't think she was lying to Kevin. I think she genuinely believed the house was hers. I think Grandma's decision is going to take a long time for her to process. I said, I know. Angela said, are we doing the right thing, keeping it? I said, what do you think? She said, I think Grandma knew what she was doing. I think she had good reasons. I think if she had wanted Melissa to have it, she would have left it to her. A pause. I also think Melissa is going to be angry at both of us for a very long time. I said, probably. Angela said, that's hard. I said, I know. Angela said, but the house is the house, and you love it. I said, I do. She said, then that's the answer. She was right. That was the answer. The house was the house. My grandmother had spent 50 years in it. My grandfather Bernard had been in that house when he died. I had sat in that kitchen on more Sunday afternoons than I could count learning to make things from scratch while Melissa was in the other room, and the house had always known, in the way that houses knew, which people understood what they were standing in. Kevin called me 4 days later. Not Melissa. Kevin. He had the voice of a man who had prepared carefully for this call and was going to stay calm and reasonable if it killed him. He said, Diana, I think we got off on the wrong foot here. I said, hi, Kevin. He said, I understand there's a trust situation with the house. Melissa and I didn't know about it, and that's been a surprise. I don't think anyone meant any harm. I said, I understand. He said, we've made some commitments based on the expectation of those funds. This has put us in a difficult position. I said, I'm sorry to hear that. He said, is there any way to, if you and Angela were willing to sell, or to even just discuss it? I said, Kevin. He said, yeah. I said, I'm not going to sell the house. Angela is not going to sell the house. That's a decision we've both made, and it's not going to change right now. He said, Diana. I said, Melissa has her bequest from the estate. Howard Barnett is handling the probate timeline. That's what's available. He said, We were counting on more than that. I said, I understand. He said, you could have told her before all this. You could have said something. I held the phone for a moment before responding. I said, Kevin, Melissa sent me a wire transfer confirmation with a smiling emoji 3 weeks after our grandmother died. She sent it to tell me she had one. If she had called me before the listing, before the contract, before any of it, and talked to me honestly, this would have been a different conversation. He was quiet. I said, I am not the person who made this situation. I am the person who signed a document with my grandmother 14 months ago because she asked me to. That's all I did. He said, right. He said, I understand. He didn't say anything else. I said, I hope things stabilize for you both. I mean that. He said, yeah. His voice had the specific flatness of someone who had run out of strategies. Thanks, Diana. He hung up. I sat in my apartment and I thought about that text message, the wire transfer photograph, the smiling emoji. Thanks for the cash. I thought about what it had meant when she sent it, the assumption behind it, the belief that I had nothing and she had one and the transaction was complete and the outcome was certain. I thought about the crumpled piece of paper on my grandmother's kitchen table 14 months ago, the one Howard had handed me with my copy of the signed trust documents, the one I had folded carefully and put in my bag and driven home with on a February evening while my grandmother sat beside me in the car and looked at the Kentucky countryside going past the window. I still had that copy in my files. It had never been crumpled, but it might as well have been a piece of paper for all Melissa had ever thought to look for it. 6 months after the will reading, I drove to Louisville on a Saturday in September when the trees in the highlands were beginning to turn, and the Victorian was golden in the late afternoon light. In the specific way, it was always golden in September. The light that made you understand immediately why people had loved this house for 50 years. I had a key. I would always have a key. That was not in question. I unlocked the door and walked in. The house smelled the same. Old wood and lavender, and the residual warmth of a home that had been lived in for a very long time by people who cared about it. My grandmother's things were still in place. We had not rushed that process. Angela and I had agreed to take our time, to be deliberate about every decision, to give the house the respect it had earned through 5 decades of being someone's most important place. I walked through the rooms. The sitting room where my grandmother had watched television in the evenings with the specific shows she had watched for 30 years. The kitchen where I had learned to make pound cake and biscuits, and the particular cornbread that was my grandmother's version and nobody else's. The dining room with the table that had held every Christmas and Thanksgiving and Easter and Sunday dinner in my memory. The stairs that creaked on the 3rd step and the 4th, which I had known since I was 6 years old, and which I still stepped over automatically without thinking about it. I went to the bedroom. My grandmother had died in this room. The bed was still here. The dresser. The photograph of her and Bernard from their wedding in 1962 that had been on the dresser for as long as I could remember and that I had looked at my whole life. The two of them young and slightly serious in the formal way of wedding photographs from that era and completely themselves in a way that came through despite the formality. I sat down on the edge of the bed. I thought about what Angela and I had decided. We had talked about it over 3 long phone calls in August. Angela was thoughtful in the way she was always thoughtful, which meant she was honest and slow and did not say anything until she was sure she meant it. She had asked me what I wanted. I had told her what I wanted. I wanted to keep the house. Not to live in it immediately. I was in Lexington and my life was in Lexington, and I was not ready to leave that yet. But to maintain it, to care for it, to use it the way a house like this deserved to be used, which was by people who understood what they were standing in. Angela had said, I think that's right, and I think Grandma would think that's right. We had agreed to rent the house to a carefully selected tenant, not a stranger from an anonymous listing, but someone who came with real references and who understood the character of the house and who would treat it with the respect it deserved. Howard Barnett had connected us with a property management firm he trusted in Louisville. We were interviewing potential tenants. The rental income would cover the carrying costs of the property, with something left over. In time, when the right moment arrived, we would make a different decision. But the right moment was not a Tuesday morning wire transfer confirmation sent with a smiling emoji. The right moment would be a decision made carefully by two people who understood what they had been given. Melissa and I had spoken once in those 6 months. A phone call in July that had lasted 12 minutes and had been, by the standards of the conversations we had been having our whole lives, remarkably honest. She had said things I hadn't known she was capable of saying, which were things that were true about herself, and about what she had done, and about the assumption she had made, and what it had revealed about what she had been thinking. She had said, "I told myself I was going to keep it, that I was going to live there, but I wasn't." She had paused. "Kevin and I, there were things we needed the money for, that we had committed to. I had told myself a story about keeping the house that wasn't the real story." I had said, "I know." She had said, "Did Grandma know?" I had said, "She knew you were planning to sell it. She told me." She had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "She knew and she didn't call me on it. She didn't say anything. She just..." I said, "She just changed the structure so the plan couldn't happen the way you planned it." Melissa said, "Yeah." I said, "That was how she did things." Melissa said, I know that's how she did things." She paused. "It's weird that even now I can't be fully angry at her. I'm angry, but I can't get all the way to it." I said, "Because you know she loved you." She said, "Yeah." I said, "She did." Melissa said, "She loved you more." I said, "She loved us differently." She said, "Diana, that is a very diplomatic answer." I said, "I know." She laughed. Once. A real one, brief and slightly grudging. The laugh of someone who had not expected to laugh and was surprised to find it available. I said, "The cash bequest, did you get it?" She said, "Yes, Howard processed it, we got it." I said, "Good." She said, "We needed it." I said, "I know." She said, "Diana." I said, "Yeah." She said, "I sent you that text message, the wire transfer." I said, "I know." She said, "I was." I said, "I know what you were." She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know." There was a pause that was the kind of pause that families had when they were on the other side of something, and were not quite sure how to be on the other side of it together. Then Melissa said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Sure." She said, "When did you find out she was doing the trust?" I said, "She asked me to come to Lexington with her to sign the documents." She said, "She asked you to come?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Not me." I said, "No." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Why you and not me? What was the difference?" I thought about that for a moment. I thought about how to say the true thing without it being a weapon. I said, "I think she trusted me with the weight of it, not because she loved you less, because she knew I would carry it quietly and not let it change how I moved through the rest of the year." She said, "That's a careful answer." I said, "It's the honest one." She said, "I would have told people." I said, "I know." She said, "Yeah." She said, "You didn't tell anyone." I said, "No." She said, "For 14 months." I said, "Yes." She said, That's actually impressive." I said, "I learned from her." Melissa was quiet. Then she said, Yeah, you did." We had hung up without making specific plans, but without the hard edge of before. Something in the call had been the first step toward something. Not forgiveness, exactly. Forgiveness was going to take time and work that we hadn't done yet. But the first step toward the thing that came before forgiveness, which was acknowledging what had actually happened clearly enough to begin moving past it. Now I sat on the edge of my grandmother's bed in September, and the afternoon light came through the curtains and fell on the floor in the particular way it always had, and the house smelled like itself, and I was alone in it with everything it held. I thought about my grandmother Ruth on a Thursday in February, in Howard Barnett's conference room, watching me sign my name on the trust document. I thought about the way she had put her hand over mine after. "You are the one who understands why I did it this way." I had understood. I still did. The house was not a prize. It was not a victory. It was not revenge for anything. It was a home that a woman had loved for 50 years and had made sure would go to the people who understood what a home was for. I was one of those people. Angela was one of those people. And my grandmother, who had paid attention for 81 years and had never made a decision carelessly, had known the difference. I'm still in Louisville every other weekend. Not staying, checking, making sure the house is maintained, making sure the tenant, a woman named Patricia Osai who teaches at one of the Louisville elementary schools and who came to us through a colleague of Howard's and who, when she walked through the house for the first time, said, "This house has been loved," with a specific recognition that made Angela and me look at each other and know, is comfortable, and that the house is being cared for the way it deserves to be cared for. Patricia has a small herb garden in the backyard. She asked me before she planted it. I said, of course. My grandmother would have loved that. The third step on the stairs still creaks. I still step over it automatically. I've been to the kitchen a few times when I visit, just to stand in it. Patricia gives me space for that without making it a thing, which tells me she's the right person to have there. She understands the house in the way that people understood a house when they were actually paying attention to it. Melissa and I have dinner once a month now. Not in Louisville, halfway between, in Elizabethtown, which was Angela's idea. Angela joins when she can. The dinners are not easy in the old way, the easy way that covers things over without actually dealing with them. They're easier in a newer way, which is the way of people who have said the true things and are figuring out how to build something real from what's left. Melissa apologized to me properly in November. Not a text. In person, across a table, with Kevin beside her, a real apology that named the specific thing and did not have a hook in it. I said thank you and I meant it. She told me something at that dinner that I've thought about many times since. She said, "I spent so much time trying to be the one who got the house that I never stopped to think about whether I was being someone Grandma would want to give it to." She had said it quietly, the way people said things when they had been thinking about them for a long time and had finally found the words. I thought the winning was about strategy, about being there and being present and managing the situation. I didn't think about whether I was actually being real. I said, "That's a hard thing to see about yourself." She said, "Yeah, it is." I said, "Grandma would be proud of you for saying it." She said, "Don't make me cry at Applebee's." I said, "We should probably be at a better restaurant." She laughed. That was the laugh. The real one, the full one, the one I had heard my whole childhood when she was genuinely surprised by something funny. I had not heard it in 2 years, and I had not realized I missed it until it was there again. Angela told me later that Melissa had also called her, that they had had a long conversation, that Melissa had asked questions about my grandmother that she had never asked before, the kind of questions that came from genuinely wanting to know rather than from positioning. Angela had said, "She's trying, Diana. I think something broke open in her when all of this happened and she's trying to figure out what to do with the space." I believe that. I believe that what my grandmother did, by making the decision she made and building the structure she built and trusting me with the Thursday in February, had done something to Melissa that nothing else had been able to do. It had removed the possibility of managing the outcome. It had removed the strategy and the positioning and the narrative management, and had left Melissa standing in a real consequence that she had to simply be in rather than spin her way out of. And in that real consequence, apparently, there was something worth encountering. I can't fully describe what I feel when I think about my grandmother and the trust and the crumpled piece of paper that was not actually crumpled. That was a carefully filed legal document in the records of the state of Kentucky. I can tell you it is not triumph. I never wanted to triumph over my sister. I wanted my grandmother's house to be okay, and the people who loved my grandmother to eventually be okay, and the things my grandmother had built to survive past her in the way that things survived when they were in the right hands. I believe those things are happening. The house is okay. Patricia has herbs in the backyard. The family is moving toward okay. It's slow. Families were always slow. And I go to Louisville every other weekend, and I unlock the door and I walk through the rooms, and I step over the third stair and I stand in the kitchen, and I smell the old wood and the lavender, and I know what I am standing in. My grandmother built this. My grandfather helped. They did it with $43,000 and every blanket they owned during a January, without a furnace and the specific willingness to build something for 50 years that would be worth more than money when it was handed down. She handed it down to the right people. I know this because I was there on a Thursday in February when she said so. That's the whole story. That's all of it. If this story hit something real, if you've ever been the quiet one, the overlooked one, the one who showed up without an agenda and found out eventually that the right person noticed, hit that like button. Leave a comment and tell me what you would have done if you were in my position. Would you have warned Melissa? Would you have done it differently? I genuinely want to know. Subscribe if you're not subscribed yet. Every story on this channel is about real things, about family and money, and what people do when the stakes are finally high enough to show who they actually are. Ring that notification bell so you don't miss a single one. Take care of yourselves. And if you have a grandmother, call her. Go see her. Sit in her kitchen and learn how she makes the things she makes. You'll be glad you did. We'll see you next time.